I sat alone in the cabin, feeling the quiet seep into my bones like the cold creeping in through the cracks in the walls. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest neighbor, with no sound but the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of distant birds. It was a place I'd come to for peace, to escape the noise of the city and get some time to myself. That night, the wind was particularly fierce. It howled through the trees outside, causing the cabin to creak and groan like some old, tired animal. I had settled into the worn armchair by the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, with a book in my hands. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows across the wooden walls. The flickering light made the room feel cozy, even though the storm outside was a reminder of how alone I really was out here. I glanced at the clock on the mantel. 11:42 p.m. I was just about to close the book and head to bed when I heard it. Someone calling my name. It was a low voice, muffled by the wind but still unmistakable. My heart skipped. I froze. I didn't move. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Hey, it's me. Open up." It was my brother's voice. I knew it immediately, even though I hadn't heard him in a while. He had a deep, easygoing tone, the kind that made everything seem less serious. But there was something wrong. It sounded distant, and the way it came through the night, through the howling wind, gave me an uneasy feeling. I pushed the blanket off, standing up and walking over to the window. I pulled the heavy curtains aside and peered outside. Nothing, just pitch black. The storm had wiped out all the light from the outside. No car in the driveway, no headlights cutting through the darkness, just the silhouettes of the trees swaying in the wind. I frowned, confused. The voice had sounded so close. I couldn't make sense of it. I moved back from the window and stood still in the center of the room, listening. The wind was still howling, but now there was silence, no more calls. I felt an unsettling shiver run down my spine. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. The trees creaking, the cabin groaning. But it didn't feel like that. I knew that feeling. This was different. "Hey, it's me." The voice came again, and this time it was louder, more insistent. "Open up." I froze, my mind scrambling. The voice didn't sound like it was from far away. It sounded like it was just outside the door. I wanted to believe it was my brother. Maybe he had driven up to surprise me after all. He knew I was here. He knew I had the cabin to myself this weekend. But something didn't add up. He was supposed to be in town. He wouldn't have driven out in the middle of the night, especially with the storm. The voice called again, this time in the same exact words. "Hey, it's me. Open up." The repetition struck me, making my stomach twist. It was like the same sentence played on loop, over and over. It didn't feel real. I felt my pulse quicken. I grabbed my phone from the table, my hands shaking as I unlocked it and called my brother. The phone rang a few times before he picked up. "Hey, what's up?" he said casually. I exhaled in relief, feeling stupid for being so rattled. "Hey, where are you? I heard your voice outside." "Outside? I'm at home," he said. There was a pause on the line, and I could hear the hum of the TV in the background. "I'm in Ohio. Didn't you know? I wasn't planning on going anywhere this weekend." My stomach dropped. That didn't make sense. The voice I had heard wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was his voice. I heard it so clearly, like he was standing right outside the cabin. "Well, I guess I'll call you tomorrow," he said, clearly unaware of the tension in my voice. I barely heard him hang up, my mind still trying to process everything. I stood there in the silence for a while, not sure what to think. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind whipping around the cabin like it was trying to tear the trees from the ground. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was out there. I sat back down in the armchair, trying to focus on my book again. But the words blurred together, and my mind kept drifting back to the voice. Why had it sounded so real? Why had it repeated itself so many times? I couldn't make sense of it, no matter how hard I tried. Just as I was about to give up and head to bed, the voice came again. This time it was louder, right outside the window. "Hey, it's me. Open up." I froze, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't heard the voice coming from the door this time. It was right there on the other side of the window. I slowly stood up and made my way over, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look outside. Nothing. The night was still pitch black, the trees swaying violently in the wind, but no sign of anyone. No car, no figure, no movement. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away from the window. The voice came again, just as before. "Hey, it's me. Open up." But this time it was different. There was a slight tremor in the words, a feeling of urgency that hadn't been there before. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any reasonable explanation. Maybe it was some prank. Maybe someone was messing with me. But who would do that? How could they make it sound like my brother's voice? I grabbed the phone again and dialed my brother's number, hoping to hear his voice again. It rang twice, but then went straight to voicemail. I left a message, telling him I wasn't sure what was going on, but that I was getting really freaked out. I didn't know who was out there, but I had to be sure it wasn't him. I had to make sure he was really safe. I waited for what felt like hours, staring at the door, the window, every shadow cast by the dim light of the fire. The storm outside howled louder than ever, rattling the walls of the cabin. But the voice didn't come back. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voice again, faintly in the distance. "Hey, it's me. Open up." It looped over and over in my mind, like a broken record, until I was too exhausted to think clearly. The next morning, I packed my things and left the cabin, despite the storm still pounding the area. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if something truly strange had happened, but I wasn't going to stay there to find out. My brother called me on the drive back, and I explained what happened. "You sure you didn't just imagine it?" he asked. "You've been alone out there for a while, haven't you?" "I know what I heard," I replied firmly. When I got home, I went straight to the phone and looked up the number for the local sheriff. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I needed to know if anything unusual had happened out there the night before. The sheriff's office didn't have any record of anyone being out in the area near my cabin. No reports of anything strange. They told me it was probably just the wind playing tricks on me, that the storm had made everything sound distorted. They didn't have any other explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The voice I heard wasn't just the wind. It was too real, too clear. It was my brother's voice, but he wasn't there. And then, when it came from outside the window, so close I could almost touch it, I knew I hadn't imagined it. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment, double-checked the security system, and still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't know what had happened at that cabin, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be going back. The fog started rolling in the night before. Thick, dense, and heavy, it seemed to creep over the landscape like an unwanted visitor. I'd been in the cabin for a couple of days already, enjoying the quiet, away from the city. The silence of the place was suffocating in its own way, but it was also what I needed. I had planned on staying for the week, away from everyone, just me and the woods. But when the fog settled in, I started feeling like I was being watched, even though I knew there was no one around for miles. It was early morning on the second day when I first saw him. The fog hadn't lifted at all. If anything, it had grown thicker, and visibility was down to a few feet. The morning was eerily still, and the sun's light was completely filtered through the dense mist. I stepped out onto the porch, hoping the fresh air would clear my head, but the dampness in the air made it worse. The porch creaked under my feet as I looked out into the gray void, trying to make sense of the blurry shapes in the distance. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, a shadow or a figment of my imagination. But there he was, standing just off the porch, barely 20 feet away, perfectly still. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. The fog made everything look different. His figure seemed to emerge from the mist, like it had been there the whole time, only now I was seeing him clearly. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that seemed too thin for the cold air. He was facing me, and he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I waved back automatically. I figured he was from one of the nearby cabins. Maybe he was lost or needed help. It wasn't uncommon for people to visit out here, and the cabins weren't all that far apart. Still, something about the way he stood there didn't sit right with me. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me from the mist. I called out, asking if he needed anything, but he didn't respond. Not a word, just stood there. I could feel my heart beat a little faster as I took a step toward him. But I stopped myself. Maybe he was just some lost hiker or someone who didn't realize how far out we were. Still, my instinct told me to be cautious. The fog made everything feel wrong, like the world had been reduced to nothing more than shadow and mist. I didn't get a good enough look at his face. Maybe he had been out here too long. I don't know. My mind started to race as I turned around to go inside. The fog was thick enough to swallow everything whole. When I looked back, just a second later, he was gone, completely vanished, like he had never been there in the first place. I stepped forward again, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, no sign of him. I was left with an uncomfortable knot in my stomach. Had he left, or had he disappeared into the mist, just as suddenly as he had appeared? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. I sat by the window, watching the fog swirl around the trees, my mind racing with questions. Was he someone who lived here? Had he been in need of help? I should have gone out to talk to him, I thought, but something about him had felt off, like I had interrupted something I shouldn't have seen. Hours passed, and the fog remained thick. It wasn't unusual for it to linger here, but today, it felt like it was pressing in on the cabin, like it wanted to swallow everything whole. The whole world was reduced to the blur of gray and white outside. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I couldn't focus. The image of that man standing there, motionless, kept playing in my mind. That night, the fog didn't lift. I tried to ignore the strange feeling that had settled over me. Maybe I was just letting my mind run wild. But then, as I sat in the dim light of the cabin, reading again, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the deck. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. But the steps were too distinct, too regular. Someone was walking on the porch. I froze. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped right at the door. I sat there, not moving, trying to decide what to do. I didn't know what I was afraid of exactly. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the fog, or maybe the strange man I had seen earlier. But something about the silence after the steps stopped felt wrong. I stood up and cautiously walked to the door. I opened it slowly, expecting to find the man from earlier, standing there, maybe confused or lost in the fog. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, scanning the porch and the surrounding area. Nothing, no sign of him, no one at all. But as I looked down, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Muddy boot prints. They were fresh, leading right up to the door, stopping exactly where I was standing. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking through thick mud. They left clear impressions, one after another, leading straight to my front door. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. The fog hung thick around me, but I could see the tracks leading up the stairs to the porch. I knelt down, studying them, trying to understand. They weren't my prints. I hadn't been outside since I had seen him earlier that day. The tracks were clear and fresh, as if someone had just walked up to the door moments ago. But when I looked around, I couldn't find where they had gone. The footprints stopped at the door and vanished. There was no sign of where they had gone after that. The porch was empty, the fog thick and unbroken. I took a step back, feeling a cold sweat bead on my forehead. The air around me felt still, suffocating even. The silence was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind me. The muddy prints outside were the only sign that anything had happened, but they didn't make sense. Who would walk all the way up to my door, leave prints, and then just disappear? It was like they had melted into the fog, as if they were never really there. I stayed up the rest of the night, unable to sleep, constantly checking the windows. Every noise outside made me tense, my eyes darting to the misty darkness outside. The fog didn't lift, and the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It was like the whole world had become a part of that thick, suffocating grayness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. The next morning, the fog was still there. It didn't lift like I thought it might. I didn't dare go outside right away. The image of the man standing out there, motionless, kept flashing in my mind. The muddy footprints still bothered me. Who was he? Why hadn't he answered when I called out to him? Why had he just disappeared? I spent the day trying to keep my mind occupied, but it was impossible. I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. I thought about leaving, but I knew I would be driving right through that same thick fog, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me out there, just beyond the edge of my sight. By the evening, the fog had not lifted. It was as if it was never going to leave. The air felt dense, almost suffocating, and I found myself pacing back and forth in the cabin. My thoughts were racing. What had really happened that morning? Who had I seen on the porch? And why hadn't he answered me? I couldn't stop running through the possibilities in my head, but none of them made sense. I heard the footsteps again that night. This time, I didn't wait to open the door. I was ready for it. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch, my pulse pounding in my ears. The fog closed in around me, making everything look unreal. I couldn't see anything more than a few feet in front of me. I felt a strange chill creep up my spine as I scanned the surroundings. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The porch was empty. I felt a strange sense of relief, but it didn't last long. My eyes landed on the muddy boot prints again. This time, they led in a full circle around the porch, as if the person had walked around it multiple times. They were fresh, clear, as if the man from the day before had never left. But where had he gone now? The truth hit me hard. It wasn't just the fog, or the strange man, or the footsteps. It was the sense of being trapped. The feeling that something was out there, just beyond the mist, something I couldn't see or understand. Something watching, waiting for the fog to lift, if it ever would. The feeling of unease had settled deep into my bones. I had no idea how to make sense of any of it, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things as quickly as I could, grabbed the keys, and left the cabin behind. The fog was still there when I drove away, clinging to the trees, surrounding the road like a thick blanket. I didn't look back, couldn't, because I knew whatever had been out there, whatever I had seen, it hadn't been a coincidence. It wasn't just the fog. It wasn't just a man lost in the mist. It was something else, and I was glad to be rid of it. I rented the cabin because I wanted quiet. I wanted off the grid, nothing around for miles kind of quiet. My job had been kicking my ass for months, and I'd stopped sleeping right. Phone calls, messages, emails at all hours, even when I was home. So I figured I'd take a few days, get away, and I invited a few friends. Just 4 of us total: me, Nick, Jess, and Warren. We all needed it, and I didn't want to be alone out there. The cabin sat about 30 miles from the nearest town, tucked in deep woods with no other homes or even trails nearby. We got there late afternoon on Friday, parked at the dead-end dirt road, and carried our gear the last half-mile down an overgrown path. It wasn't a fancy place, just a 1-story log structure with a little deck and a tin roof, a wood stove, some bunk beds, a half-rotten outhouse. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, no neighbors. The first night was good. We sat around a fire out back, cooked up some food, drank a little. Nothing crazy. We didn't even stay up late. Around 10, the woods started to feel darker than normal. Not just night dark, like the trees were leaning in a little too much. The kind of dark where flashlights just seemed to vanish a few feet out. No moon, no stars. You couldn't even see your breath. I went in first, the others followed. We locked up, killed the lanterns, and went to bed. The second day was slow, like it should be. We hiked a bit, took turns chopping wood. We had enough food and beer for the weekend. The air was cold but not freezing. In the afternoon we played cards, cracked a few jokes, shared stories. I could feel myself unwinding, like that tightness I'd been carrying for months was starting to loosen. Felt good. I even said it out loud. I forgot what it's like to not hear notifications all day. That night, we didn't make a fire. The wind had picked up, and it felt colder. Not freezing, but sharp in the kind of way that gets under your clothes and sits there. So we stayed inside. We had one gas lantern on the table and a few candles. Around 10, we started winding down. Nick and Warren were in their bunks, already halfway to sleep. Jess and I were sitting near the window, just watching the woods. I couldn't see much past the first tree line. Black trunks, shapes of limbs, nothing more. No animals, no movement. Then I saw the first one. It looked like a firefly at first. A small blue light low to the ground, maybe waist height. I figured maybe we were seeing bugs, but it was late October, too cold for bugs. Then I saw a second one. Same height, same color. Then a third. They were about 10 feet apart from each other, maybe more. Not flickering, just glowing. And they were moving in a straight line across the woods. Too smooth to be handheld flashlights. No bounce, no shifting, just gliding. I tapped the window once and just looked. We both leaned closer. The lights kept coming. Blue, soft, unblinking, all at the same height. No sound, no footsteps, no crunching leaves, no snapping twigs. Just silence and those lights floating between the trees, moving slow, in a wide arc around the cabin. I turned off the lantern and told the others to wake up. We sat in the dark, all four of us by the windows, watching. They kept coming, more of them, maybe 10, maybe 15, forming a circle. A wide one closing in foot by foot, but slow. No faces, no shapes behind them, just the blue glow, a little brighter now, and silent movement through the trees. At midnight, they stopped. We counted 7 visible from the front windows. Some might have been behind the cabin. We didn't know. We waited. Nothing moved for a while. It was like the lights were watching, maybe, or just sitting there, hovering, like someone holding a flashlight steady from 100 feet away. But no beam, just glow. Then one moved, a little, toward the cabin. Then another. Then all of them. They glided closer, slow and smooth, until they were right outside the windows. No more than 5 feet away. We backed up. I turned off the last candle. It was pitch black inside. We crouched near the bunks, waiting. Still not a sound. Then the front doorknob turned. It was slow. I heard it more than I saw it. A steady metal squeak, soft but clear. Someone was turning it gently, testing it. Then again, a little more force this time. The latch rattled. Still locked. I grabbed the hatchet we'd used to split firewood. Nick had a tire iron he'd brought with his gear. Warren had a long hunting knife, still sheathed. Jess grabbed the fire poker. None of us said anything, just crouched in the dark, watching the door, breathing as quiet as we could. My heart was hammering, not fast but hard, like I could feel it in my arms and ears. Every muscle in my body was tight, cold sweat down my back. The knob turned again, this time a few sharp jerks. Then nothing. The lights didn't move. They stayed outside the windows, hovering, watching, for the next hour, maybe more. One of them drifted along the side of the cabin, past the kitchen window. I followed it as best I could, but the window was too small. A few minutes later, I heard something scratch against the back wall. Then silence again. No voices, no footsteps, just those lights. And us, crouched in the dark with our breath held and our backs against the cold wood walls. It was like time stretched. I kept checking my watch. At one point, it was 2:12 a.m., then 2:19, then 2:46. No one spoke. The lights didn't move again. Eventually, one of them flickered and went out. Then another, then 2 more. One by one, they faded. Not all at once, just gone. By the time my watch said 4:11, they were all gone. We stayed where we were until dawn. No one really slept. I don't think I blinked more than twice. As soon as the first gray light came through the trees, we opened the door and stepped out. The air was cold and damp, like it had rained, but the ground was dry. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anyone or anything. But there was something. All around the cabin, in a perfect circle, the pine needles had been pushed aside. Not kicked, not scraped, just parted, like something moved over them slowly and deliberately. The circle was maybe 30 feet out from the cabin walls, perfectly round, and inside it the needles had been pushed into lines, parallel, straight, about 10 inches apart all the way around, like the path of wheels maybe, or sleds, or something sliding through the woods. We packed up fast, threw everything into our bags, didn't even bother folding the tarps or tying down gear, just grabbed what we could and moved. I locked the cabin out of habit, even though I knew it was pointless. We didn't speak much on the hike out, just the sound of our boots and our breathing. Nobody looked back. When we got to the car, we drove without stopping until we hit a main road. I checked my phone. Dozens of missed messages and emails, all the crap I thought I was escaping. I didn't answer any of it. Back in town, we had breakfast at a diner. Nobody mentioned what happened. It was like we all needed time to figure out what we'd seen. What it was. We didn't know. Still don't. There were no ghost stories. No figures in the dark. No red eyes, no growls in the night. Just lights. Silent, slow-moving lights. And the feeling that something was testing the edges of our space. Watching us. Figuring out how close it could get. I've tried to explain it. To myself, mostly. Maybe it was drones. But there was no hum, no mechanical sound. And no one hikes 30 miles into nowhere to fly a bunch of silent drones in a perfect formation for hours in the dead of night. Maybe it was some weird military thing, but there were no tracks, no boot prints, no equipment, and how would they know we were there? The cabin wasn't on any map. I found it through a friend of a friend. No listing, no registry, or maybe it was people. But who moves like that in the woods without making a single sound? Who stands outside a cabin in the dark for hours without speaking, without moving, just turning a doorknob now and then? We never talked about it again. Not really. Jess moved to Oregon a few months later. Nick and Warren drifted off. I still talk to them here and there, but we never bring up the cabin. And none of us ever went back. I still have the key on my ring, but I know I'll never use it again. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those lights, the way they moved, the way they hovered right outside, not touching, not forcing, just waiting, like they were learning something, testing something. I don't know what they were, but they weren't bugs. They weren't lights in the distance. They weren't fireflies. They were deliberate, quiet, and they didn't want in that night. They wanted to see if they could get in, and I think one day they will. I had been hiking alone through the woods for a few days, trying to get away from everything, looking for some quiet. I wasn't exactly sure where I was going, but I had marked a spot on the map where an old woodcutter's cabin was supposed to be. My plan was to rest for a night or two before heading back. The cabin wasn't too far from the trail, but it felt far enough to make it feel isolated. It had a rough, rustic charm to it, surrounded by tall trees and thick brush, like something out of a forgotten time. I arrived in the late afternoon, the air still and warm, the only sounds being the distant calls of birds. The cabin itself was small, with weathered wood and a sloped roof. It looked like it had been here for decades, maybe longer. The inside wasn't much better. There was a fireplace on the far wall, a rough-hewn wooden table, and a couple of chairs with tattered cushions. Dust covered everything, and the smell of old wood and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. There was a stack of firewood in the corner, and the windows, though grimy, still let in enough light. A single bed in the corner had a thin blanket and a pillow that looked like it had seen better days. I didn't care. I was just looking for a place to crash for a couple of days and get some peace and quiet. I built a fire in the fireplace, which crackled to life quickly with the dry wood, and sat down at the table with a book. The wind outside picked up, making the trees sway and creak. It was the kind of evening that made the forest feel alive, but also unnerving in its silence. As night settled in, the sounds from outside became distant whispers, but something inside the cabin began to pull my attention. It started low at first, a faint scratching sound from the fireplace, like something was tapping against the chimney. I figured it was just a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten into the flue, looking for shelter. I'd read about this kind of thing before. It wasn't uncommon for animals to crawl up into chimneys and get stuck, scratching as they tried to find their way out. But the sound wasn't random, it was slow. A rhythmic scraping, deliberate, and almost like it was trying to communicate something. The more I heard it, the more uncomfortable I became. I stood up, walked over to the fireplace, and looked into the chimney. I couldn't see anything, of course. It was just black, a hole leading up into the unknown. I tried shaking it off, telling myself it was just some animal stuck in there, and I should mind my own business. I sat back down and tried to get back to my book. That's when I heard it. A low whisper, barely audible at first, almost like a breath against the wind. It wasn't clear, but it felt wrong. Not like the wind or the trees. This voice came from inside the chimney, from deep within the darkness. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a pressure in the air that made my skin crawl. It was like something was watching me. The whisper repeated again, barely audible, but this time, the tone was different. It sounded pleading, desperate, almost. Help! I froze. I had to be imagining things, right? I wasn't someone who jumped at shadows or let my mind play tricks on me. But that whisper, it was something else. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was too human. I stood up again, heart pounding in my chest. I walked back to the fireplace, my hands shaking now as I crouched down and peered into the chimney. The darkness stared back at me, unmoving. There was no sign of any animal, no rustling, no movement, just silence. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. Let me out. The voice was soft, almost like a groan, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from inside the chimney, and I could feel my blood run cold. I had no idea what I was hearing, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't natural. Something wasn't right. I stepped back, my mind racing. I had to be hearing things. There was no way a person could be trapped inside the chimney, especially not in a cabin like this, far away from civilization. But there was no way to ignore what I had just heard. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the dark chimney, sweeping the beam over the walls. The light bounced off the rough stone, illuminating nothing but the same endless darkness. But then I thought I saw something, a flicker, a shadow moving against the walls of the chimney. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly turned the light off, the silence now deafening. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, but I didn't want to seem like a coward either. I could leave, head back to the trail, and forget this place ever existed. But there was something about it, something that made me stay. I don't know if it was the isolation or the strange feeling that something needed to be uncovered, but I wasn't ready to leave just yet. I sealed the fireplace the next morning. I went out and gathered plywood and heavy stones from the forest, careful to block up the chimney as best as I could. If there was something in there, something that was whispering, then it wasn't getting out. Not while I was here. The rest of the day passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, I ate in silence, the fire crackling softly as the wind howled outside. My thoughts kept drifting back to the voice, to the pleading words that had come from the darkness of the chimney. It was impossible, I knew that, but it felt too real to just dismiss. Night fell, and I tried to sleep, but the scratching started again. This time it was louder, more frantic. It was coming from behind the plywood, scraping against the boards in long, desperate streaks. I sat up in bed, listening, my pulse racing as the sound continued, relentless. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. It sounded like someone was trying to get out, trying to break through. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding as I crept over to the fireplace. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. I aimed the light into the chimney again, but this time the shadows seemed to move in the beam. There was something there, something shifting in the darkness. My hands were shaking as I dropped the flashlight, the light bouncing off the walls as I scrambled back from the fireplace. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. The air was still, thick with silence. I stayed frozen in place, my mind racing, unsure of what to do next. The fire crackled softly, the only sound filling the room now. Then I heard it, the voice again. "Let me out." But this time it was clearer than ever. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a demand. There was no pleading in the voice now, just anger, frustration, and something darker. It was unmistakable, like it was speaking directly to me, its words cutting through the silence. I grabbed my things and ran out of the cabin. My legs were weak, but I forced myself to move. The air outside was cold and sharp, and the trees seemed to tower over me, watching me as I fled into the forest. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just had to get away from that cabin. As I ran through the forest, the wind howled in my ears, but the voices of the forest seemed distant. When I finally made it to the main trail, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, my body shaking. The forest was quiet again, but I knew that the cabin wasn't. The scratching, the voice, it would always be there, just waiting deep in the heart of those woods. I never went back. I'd been hiking that stretch of forest since I was a teenager. I knew the ridgelines like the back of my hand, knew the best spots to catch the sunset, where the streams cut deep into the hills, where the deer bedded down at night, and where to find the freshest berries late in the season. I'd spent years mapping that place out in my own way, no GPS, just my boots and memory. The woods felt like home, more than any four walls I'd ever lived in. So when I came around that bend and saw a cabin I swear hadn't been there before, it stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't just that it was old. Plenty of old hunting shacks and logging huts out here. But this thing, it looked ancient, like it had sunken halfway into the ground. Moss climbed up the walls, thick and dark, like a carpet that had grown undisturbed for decades. The wood was blackened with age and damp. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were clouded over with grime and dust. But the strangest thing was how silent it was. Not a bird call, not a single insect buzzed. Just quiet. I stood there a long minute, just looking. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I pulled out my map, worn and soft from years of folding, and ran my finger along the trail. Nothing. No marks, no old buildings noted. And I knew this bend. It came after the long stretch of pine that opened up near the edge of a dry creek bed. I'd been here hundreds of times. There had never been a cabin. Still, curiosity has a way of turning hesitation into action. I walked up to it, slow and quiet, like I expected something to jump out at me. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges. I nudged it open with my boot, and it let out a groan that echoed too loud in the still air. Inside, it was about what you'd expect, dusty, dry, forgotten. Cobwebs hung in thick ropes from the ceiling beams, and dead leaves had blown in and settled into the corners. A single chair sat in the corner, and a rotted table leaned crooked against the wall. There was no smell of decay, just dry wood and dust. No signs of animals nesting inside either, which was strange. Normally places like this were home to squirrels, raccoons, sometimes birds, but this place was too quiet. I stepped in. The floor creaked under my weight. I moved slow, looking at the corners, the ceiling, trying to figure out what this place was. There were no markings, no signs, nothing to give away its history. Just wood, dust, and silence. I walked around the room once, checked behind the chair, looked under the table. Just dust and emptiness. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, but the screen was black, dead. I'd had it charged before the hike, full battery. I held the button down. Nothing. That was when the first itch of unease crept in. But I pushed it down. Maybe the cold had drained it. I'd had that happen before in the winter, except it was spring, 60 degrees and mild. I turned back to the door, figured I'd seen enough, but when I grabbed the handle and gave it a pull, it didn't move. I frowned and pulled harder. The old wood groaned, but the door didn't open. I kicked at the bottom, thinking maybe it was warped or stuck. Still nothing. I leaned my full weight into it. No movement. It was like it had fused to the frame. That uneasy feeling came back stronger this time. I stepped back, looking around the room, trying to spot another exit. There wasn't one. Just 4 walls, that one door, and 2 small windows too high and too narrow to climb through. I tried the door again, harder this time, slamming my shoulder into it. Still nothing. That's when I turned around to scan the room again, and everything was different. It was subtle at first. The chair was in the same place. The table still slumped against the wall, but the light had changed. Before, it had been dim but natural, coming in through the dirty windows. Now it was darker, and the dust, it was gone. The cobwebs were still there, but the floor looked swept, clean, like someone had just tidied up. I took a few steps back from the door, heart thumping now. I told myself I must have missed it. Maybe the light had shifted, or I'd imagined the dust. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint, but there, leading from the door to the chair. And they weren't mine. My boots were heavy, thick-soled, and left a wide tread. These were smaller, barefoot. The shape was clear in the dust. Toes, heel, the curve of the foot. And there were several of them walking in and out around the table, around the chair. At least 3 different sets. Maybe 4. I felt a cold sweat creep up my back. I backed toward the window, peering out. The forest looked the same. Trees, creek bed. But everything seemed muted, like I was looking at a picture of it instead of the real thing. And the silence. That was the worst part. Even deep in the forest, you can hear something. Wind in the trees, birds calling, insects buzzing. Here, nothing. Like the world outside didn't exist anymore. I tried the door again. Nothing. I kicked it until my heel hurt, pounded the wall with both fists, yelling until my throat went dry. No sound came back. After what felt like an hour, I gave up and sat on the floor, staring at those footprints. I needed to think. I needed to understand what was happening, but none of it made sense. It wasn't a hallucination. I wasn't dehydrated, hadn't hit my head. I'd eaten that morning. I was rested. I was alone. I knew that much. Eventually, I stood up and started checking the cabin in more detail. I pressed on every wall, looking for gaps, hinges, false panels. I knocked on the boards, listening for hollow spots. I crawled under the table, lifted the chair. I pried at the floorboards near the corner. Nothing. Everything was solid and old. But then I noticed the corner behind the chair seemed darker than the rest. Just barely. Like the shadows there were deeper. I walked over and reached out, and my hand went right through the wall. Felt cold, like pushing into a freezer. And behind that patch of wall, I felt nothing. Just open space. I pulled my hand back and looked closer. The wood looked the same, but my fingers had gone through it like mist. I didn't want to do it. Every instinct told me not to, but I had no choice. I pushed both hands into the wall, then one foot, then the other, and I stepped through. Suddenly I was standing in the same room, but it was different again. Now the cabin looked newer. The walls were still old, but not rotten. The moss was gone. The floor was swept clean, and the table had a cup on it. A tin cup with something dark inside. The chair was upright. There was a bundle of cloth in the corner, maybe a bedroll or blanket. It looked like someone lived here. My breath caught in my throat. I turned back to look at the wall I'd come through. It looked solid now, just planks. I reached out and touched it. Hard wood, no give. I was trapped again or still. I didn't know anymore. I sat on the chair, staring at the cup. I didn't touch it. I just waited. Time passed. I don't know how much. Hours, maybe. The light never changed. I didn't get hungry. I didn't feel tired. It felt like I was stuck in a moment that didn't move forward. Eventually, I stood up again, pushed at the door. Still locked. I tried the windows, but they were sealed shut. The wood was too thick to break. I thought about smashing the chair into it, but something held me back. Like the room was watching me. That was the worst part. the sense that I wasn't alone, even though no one was there. No movement, no sound. Just this growing awareness that something in the cabin was aware of me. I tried lying down. I tried sleeping. Couldn't. My mind raced in circles. I retraced the footprints in my head. Remembered the feeling of the cold behind the wall. The light that didn't change. And then one moment, just like that, the door opened. No sound, no warning. I turned and saw it swinging open, slow and smooth. I didn't question it. I grabbed my pack and ran out into the woods, not looking back. I ran until my lungs burned, until I heard birds again, wind again, the sound of a branch cracking under my boot. I ran until I hit the trail I knew, the real trail, and followed it straight back to my truck. I didn't stop moving until I'd driven 15 miles down the road and pulled off at a gas station. I sat there, parked, just breathing. My phone worked again. Full signal. Battery at 83%. I checked the GPS, checked the maps. That bend in the trail? Nothing there. No structure marked. No notes. Just forest. I went back the next weekend. I had to. I needed to see it in the daylight. Brought a friend this time, just in case. We hiked the trail slow, careful, eyes open. When we got to the bend, there was nothing. No cabin. No foundation. No disturbed ground. Just trees and moss and the sound of the creek. I walked every inch of that area. GPS showed we were in the right place. I knew it was the right place. There was nothing. I haven't been back since. I had been staying in the old cabin for a week by the time I found it. The cabin was remote, isolated from any nearby town or house, tucked deep in the woods where the only sounds were those of the forest, birds chirping, the rustling of trees, the occasional squirrel scampering across the roof. It was the perfect place to get away, to clear my head after a long stretch of work. I'd come out here to unwind, to leave the chaos of city life behind. The place was small, one room with a kitchen corner, a wood-burning stove, and a bed that creaked whenever you moved. It was older than anything I'd ever lived in, but it had a certain charm, a rustic feeling that made me feel like I was in another time, far away from the comforts I was used to. The wood floors were dark and rough, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that had long ago lost its vibrant colors. But despite the age, the cabin felt solid, if a little drafty. That morning, I had decided to clean up a bit. The place could use a good dusting, and the bed needed to be made up. I didn't expect to find anything out of the ordinary, maybe some old dirt or dust bunnies under the bed. But that was it. I bent down to move the old bed frame out of the way, and that's when I noticed the loose board. At first, I thought it was just a gap in the floorboards, maybe from years of settling. But when I tried to slide my hand along it, I realized it wasn't fixed in place. The board shifted, revealing a small compartment beneath it. Curious, I carefully lifted the board the rest of the way, my fingers brushing against something brittle. It was an old journal, its cover dark with age and the edges frayed. I picked it up, dusting it off, and sat down on the bed to examine it. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed, the ink faded in places. It looked like it had been hidden for decades, forgotten by whoever had lived here before. I opened it up, half expecting it to be filled with meaningless scribbles or perhaps some old ramblings of the cabin's previous occupant. But as I flipped through the pages, most of it seemed like nonsense. Jumbled thoughts, random observations about the weather, the seasons changing, and the occasional note about people who had passed through the area. But towards the end, something caught my eye. The handwriting was different, sharper. The last entry sent a cold chill down my spine. If you're reading this, it's too late. It knows you've seen it. I stopped for a moment, staring at the words, trying to make sense of them. My mind raced. Was it a joke? A prank left behind by someone? Maybe the previous occupant had been a bit unstable, and I had just stumbled across their final, frantic thoughts. But the words, they lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. I laughed to myself. It knows you've seen it. Sure, I thought, probably just some nonsense written down to make it seem more mysterious. But deep down, something about it felt unsettling. I closed the journal and set it aside. I didn't want to dwell on it. It was just a piece of paper, right? I'd probably forgotten about it by the end of the day. But when night fell, things started to change. I had been sitting in the living area, reading by the dim light of the oil lamp, when it happened. A loud thud echoed through the cabin, followed by the sound of something scraping across the floor. My heart jumped. I froze, eyes darting to the source of the noise. The lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the room. I stood up, my breath shallow. Nothing was out of place. The lamp hadn't fallen over. The firewood bin was still in its corner, untouched. But I knew I'd heard it. Something had knocked over the lamp. I checked everything again, my hands shaking slightly, but I couldn't find any explanation for it. I told myself it was just my imagination, the wind, or maybe even the settling of the cabin. But as I tried to settle back down, I heard it again, a soft thump, like something heavy being dropped, and then the creaking of the floorboards, faint and distant, but distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. I sat there for a long time, too afraid to move, waiting for the sounds to stop. The room felt colder than it had before. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching across the walls. But when I finally gathered the courage to look around again, nothing had changed. No sign of anything unusual. No one had entered the cabin. The fire in the stove was still warm, the flames flickering softly. I convinced myself it was just my nerves. The silence of the cabin, the isolation, it was all getting to me. But that night, it was harder to sleep. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified, like the cabin itself was alive, watching me. The next morning, I checked the floor under the bed again. The board I had moved earlier was back in place, firmly fixed where it had been. The journal, however, was gone. In its place was a fresh page of paper, the ink still damp. I reached for it, my hands trembling, and read the words, "Don't leave the cabin after dark." My stomach dropped, my mind racing. I thought it was just a prank. Someone must have been playing tricks on me. But as I stared at the words, something inside me knew it wasn't a joke. I had no idea what it meant, but I couldn't ignore the fear that crept into my chest. I spent the rest of the day trying to brush it off, telling myself it was just an old piece of paper, probably left behind by someone who had been here before. Maybe they were just as isolated as I was, going a little stir-crazy from the silence. But when night came again, I felt the weight of the journal's warning hanging over me. I wasn't sure what to do. I wanted to leave, but something held me in place. The cabin felt different now, like it wasn't mine anymore, like it had changed overnight. The fire crackled in the stove, but the warmth didn't seem to reach me. I felt cold, as if the walls were closing in. The noises started again, soft thumps, shifting boards, but this time they seemed closer, louder. I gripped the chair I was sitting in, my knuckles white, as I listened. A sharp scrape of something across the floor, then a sudden crash. My heart raced. I stood up, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The fear had me rooted to the spot. The door to the cabin was locked, the windows shut. No one else was out there. But still, the sounds continued. Something was moving around, just outside my view. I tried to shake it off, but my fear only grew. Then came a knock, quiet at first, almost like a whisper, but growing louder. Someone was at the door. I backed away, not sure what to do. The knocking stopped, and in the silence, I could hear my own breath, shallow and fast. The door was solid, and I didn't dare open it. For hours, I sat in that chair, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the sounds to stop. But they didn't, and as I watched the shadows shift, I realized that I had heard something else. Footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, moving around the house. By dawn, I had lost track of time. I had barely slept, my eyes red and burning, my heart still racing from the terror that gripped me. When the sun rose, I went outside. The air was fresh and cool, and for a moment, it felt like everything was normal again. But there were no signs of anyone, no footprints in the dirt outside the door. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed up my things quickly, throwing clothes and supplies into my bag, ready to get out of there. But just as I was about to leave, I saw it. A flash of movement in the trees just beyond the cabin. I couldn't make out what it was, but something in my gut told me to stay inside. I locked the door behind me, and for the first time in days, I didn't hear the sounds anymore. But I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like the cabin was mine anymore. The warning in the journal was real. Something had been out there. Something new. I had seen it. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the isolation getting to me. But part of me will always wonder, what if the warning in that journal was real? What if something out there was waiting for me to leave? Something that would follow me if I ever came back. I still don't know what it was. I never found out, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. The knowledge that something had been waiting in the dark for me to make a mistake. And maybe, just maybe, it was still out there, waiting for someone else to walk through the door. The cabin was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a weekend away from the city, a place to escape the noise and the constant rush of life. I'd found it online, a small, remote cabin tucked away in the woods, with nothing but trees and silence surrounding it. The drive there was long, but peaceful. The cabin itself wasn't much. An old wooden structure with a rusted tin roof and a faded, weathered porch that creaked when I stepped on it. But it had character, and for some reason that appealed to me. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and cozy enough to be a retreat. The first night, I settled in, unpacked my things, and made myself a cup of tea. The place had an old, lived-in feel, with mismatched furniture and faded curtains. A stone fireplace sat in the corner of the living room, the hearth cold and empty, but it made the place feel homey. I wandered around the cabin, checking out each room. It was small, only 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and the living room, but it was enough for a weekend away. It wasn't until I went down the narrow hallway that I noticed it. The mirror. It was an old, full-length mirror, framed in tarnished gold. The kind of mirror you might find in an estate sale, its frame heavy with age, and its glass slightly warped. It hung in the hallway, reflecting the dim light of the cabin. At first, I didn't think much of it. The mirror was out of place, yes, but it wasn't anything that immediately caught my attention. I walked by it a few times, absent-mindedly glancing at my reflection, before continuing with my day. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, read a book, and then went to bed early. The silence was deafening, but it was the kind of silence I'd come for. The kind of silence that wraps around you and settles deep in your bones. It wasn't until the second day that I started to notice something odd. As I walked down the hallway, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as I passed by, I realized that my reflection didn't move at the same time as I did. It was as if it was a fraction of a second behind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I was tired from the long drive the day before. Maybe the mirror was warped, or maybe the lighting was playing tricks on me. I shrugged it off, but the feeling lingered. It was like something was off, something that didn't make sense. Over the course of the weekend, I started paying more attention to the mirror. Every time I walked by, I noticed it again. My reflection was always just a little behind me. It wasn't huge, just a split-second difference, but it was enough to make my stomach churn with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, after dinner, I stood in front of the mirror for a while, just staring at myself. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't look away. My reflection stared back at me, as still as a photograph. I looked at my eyes, the way they reflected the light in the room, and wondered why I felt so uncomfortable. I focused on my own face, the small details, the slight wrinkles near my eyes, the faint freckles across my nose. Everything seemed so normal, but then it happened. My reflection smiled. I hadn't moved my face at all. I hadn't even thought about smiling. Yet there it was, my reflection, its mouth curving upward into a wide grin. The smile was slow, deliberate, and unsettling. My heart stopped in my chest. I took a step back, my eyes locked on the mirror, expecting my reflection to return to its normal, neutral expression. But it didn't. My reflection stayed there, smiling. I felt a cold chill run through me. My skin prickled, my breath shallow. I took another step back, but my reflection stayed frozen, its grin widening just a little. I felt a surge of panic in my chest. I moved again. This time, I turned away from the mirror, quickly walking down the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. But when I looked back, I saw my reflection still in the mirror, its smile stretching wider. That was when I ran. I didn't even think about it. I turned and bolted out of the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, in the cold night air. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? Was I imagining it? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I didn't go back into the cabin that night. I stayed outside, pacing, trying to convince myself that it had just been a trick of the light or my imagination. I told myself over and over that I was being ridiculous, but deep down, I knew what I had seen, and it terrified me. The next morning, I reluctantly returned to the cabin. The sun had risen, casting warm light through the trees, and everything seemed calm. The mirror was still there, hanging in the hallway, its tarnished frame catching the light. I stood in front of it again, staring into my reflection, half expecting it to do something strange. But nothing happened. It was just me, standing there, looking back at myself. I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a product of my tiredness and the strange lighting in the cabin. But I couldn't forget the smile. I couldn't forget the way it felt, like something had been watching me, waiting for me to notice. The rest of the weekend passed uneventfully. I stayed in the cabin, did some reading, and went for a walk in the woods, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But every time I passed the mirror, I couldn't help but glance at it, wondering if I'd see the reflection of that unsettling smile again. It never happened, but the feeling didn't go away. On the last morning, I packed my things and made one final pass through the cabin, checking that I hadn't left anything behind. I walked down the hallway, past the mirror, and stopped in front of it, just for a moment. I didn't expect anything to happen, but as I looked into the glass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The reflection wasn't just a little behind me this time. It was standing still, watching me. My reflection, no, its reflection, was staring at me with a grin that had stretched wider, the corners of its mouth curving up unnaturally, almost inhumanly. I felt my stomach drop, my hands shaking. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I turned away, bolting out of the cabin, my heart racing. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I threw my bags in the car and drove away, not looking back, not even once. When I returned the next day, I went back to the cabin. I hadn't planned on it, but something felt off, like I needed to see something with my own eyes. The cabin was still there, unchanged. But when I entered, the hallway felt emptier, darker. The mirror was gone, no trace of it anywhere. No frame, no glass, nothing. I searched the cabin, checking every room, every closet, but there was nothing. It was as if the mirror had never been there at all. I stood there, in the middle of the hallway, trying to make sense of it. What had happened? Was I losing my mind? Had the mirror just been taken by someone else? I couldn't answer any of those questions, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been in that mirror, it was real, and it wasn't something I could explain. As I left the cabin for the last time, I didn't feel any relief. The woods, once so peaceful, now felt oppressive, like something was lurking just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image of that smile, frozen in my mind, would be with me forever. I never went back to that cabin, and I've never seen another mirror like that one again. I was staying at a lakeside cabin for a week. It was a small, rustic place, tucked away in the middle of a dense forest. The kind of cabin that would make anyone forget the world outside. The kind you picture in a postcard. The view of the lake was stunning, silent, smooth water that stretched out in front of me, the sunlight reflecting off of it like something out of a dream. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. It was a simple one-bedroom with an old wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, and a porch that overlooked the water. I had come up to this remote spot to get away from everything, to clear my head, to find peace in solitude. It was peaceful at first. The days were quiet, spent walking the trails through the woods, sitting by the lake, and reading in the evenings. It was exactly what I had hoped for, but it was one particular night that changed everything. I had been staying at the cabin for a few days when the evening air turned cool. It was late, around 10 o'clock, and I had just finished dinner. There was no one around, and that's exactly how I liked it. I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The sun had set, and the stars were starting to appear in the sky. The air was crisp, the scent of pine needles mixing with the faint, earthy smell of the lake. I walked down the small path toward the shore, the gravel crunching under my boots, the faint sound of the water lapping at the rocks making it feel even quieter. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Standing in the water just across the lake was a woman. She was ankle deep in the water, standing still, facing directly toward my cabin. It was too dark to make out details clearly, but her figure was unmistakable. A woman, in a long, flowing dress, standing there motionless. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was a hiker, someone who had gotten lost, or someone out on a late-night swim. But the more I stared at her, the more uneasy I felt. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. "Hey, are you okay?" There was no response, not even a movement. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me in any way. She just stood there, facing the cabin. I called out again, louder this time, hoping to get some kind of reaction, but nothing. She remained perfectly still. I stood there for a while longer, unsure of what to do. The silence between us stretched, heavy and unnerving. It was so still, almost unnatural. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I turned around and walked back up the path to the cabin, my footsteps quickening with each step. I locked the door behind me, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to the sounds of birds chirping and the early morning light streaming through the windows. I went outside to check the lake to see if the woman was still there, but she was gone. The water was calm, the shore empty. The lake looked as peaceful as ever, and I convinced myself that I must have been seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe my mind was playing games on me in the solitude. I let it go, deciding to enjoy the rest of my time there. But that night, she was back. I had just finished a book I'd been reading and decided to step outside again for a little while. The cool night air hit me as I walked down the porch steps, and for a second, I thought I might be imagining things. But there she was, the woman, standing in the same spot in the water, facing my cabin, unmoving. I froze in place. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was no way she could have gotten there so quickly. I checked again, but there were no other cabins around the lake. None. I knew this because I had walked around the entire lake earlier in the day. There were no other houses or structures anywhere nearby. No one else could possibly be staying out there. I called out to her again, but my voice was quieter this time, more hesitant. No response. I watched her for a while, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't move. She just stood there, looking across the water toward the cabin, as if waiting for something. It was like she was frozen in time, an eerie stillness about her. I stayed outside a bit longer, staring at her, trying to figure out what was going on. I considered walking down to the water to see if I could help or get a closer look, but something stopped me. Something in my gut told me to stay put, that it wasn't a good idea. So, I went back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me again. The thought of her standing out there, facing me, sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. The next morning, she was gone again. No sign of her. The water was still and calm, and everything seemed normal, but my peace was gone. The unease settled in, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every night after that, she returned. Always in the same spot, always facing my cabin. I never saw her leave, and I never saw anyone else around. She was always alone. Sometimes I'd stand at the window, watching her from a distance, wondering what she was doing, why she was there. Each time, I felt the same weight of fear settle on me, that nagging feeling that something wasn't right. By the fourth night, she was a little closer. She had moved a few steps forward, the water now reaching up to her knees. She still didn't acknowledge me, still didn't move, but I could see her clearer now, the outline of her figure more defined in the moonlight. I could see that her dress was long and dark, hanging loosely around her, the fabric catching the breeze. She looked thin, almost gaunt, like someone who hadn't eaten in a long time. Her hair was long, hanging down over her shoulders, but I couldn't make out any features on her face. She remained a shadow, a figure in the distance, always standing still, always facing the cabin. I don't know why, but this time, I couldn't stop myself from walking toward the water. Maybe I was tired of the fear, tired of the tension, or maybe I just needed answers. My heart was beating wildly as I stepped down toward the shore. The gravel crunched under my boots, but I didn't care. I had to know what was going on. I got closer to the edge of the water, closer to her, but she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. I stood there, staring at her, and for a moment, I thought I could see something in her eyes. There was a darkness there, something hollow, something that made me feel like I was staring into a void. I opened my mouth to call out, but nothing came out. I was frozen in place. And then, as suddenly as it had started, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. No footsteps, no movement, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. I looked back toward the water, but she was gone. I don't know how she moved so quickly, but she wasn't standing there anymore. The water was empty. I didn't stay outside much longer that night. I went back to the cabin, locked all the windows and doors, and sat there, listening to the silence. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that maybe I was just overthinking everything. But I knew the truth. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it in my bones. The next day, I packed up my things. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't know who she was, what she was doing there, or why she was watching me, but I had had enough. I didn't even finish my vacation. I drove off, back toward the nearest town, as fast as I could. It's been years now, and I still don't know what happened at that cabin. I never told anyone, not until now. I never went back to that lake, and I never stayed in a cabin like that again. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I think back to those nights, to her standing there, always a little closer each time, always watching. And I wonder if anyone else ever saw her. The snow had started to fall heavier around me, swirling in the wind like a thick, white fog. I pulled my hood tighter over my head and pushed forward, feeling the crunch of snow beneath my boots with every step. The winter landscape was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the bare branches and the soft pat of snowflakes landing around me. I'd been hiking through the woods for hours, hoping to find my way back to the cabin before nightfall. The air was crisp, biting at my exposed skin, but it felt good to move, to keep going. I'd set out earlier that day to do some exploring, wanting to stretch my legs and clear my mind. But as the afternoon wore on, the weather turned colder and the snow began to fall heavier, quicker. The trails I had followed earlier had disappeared under the thick blanket of snow, and now I was relying on my own footsteps to find my way back. I remembered the way I had come. Left turn at the creek, right at the large fallen tree, straight through the clearing, and I followed my tracks carefully, looking for the indentations left by my boots in the snow. I figured I wasn't far off from the cabin. I could almost feel the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the cabin walls waiting for me. It wasn't far, but as I reached the clearing, I felt the first stirrings of unease. Something wasn't right. I stopped, blinking against the falling snow, my breath misting in front of my face. My tracks were gone. There was nothing. The snow was untouched, smooth, not a single sign of where I had walked. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'd wandered off course. Maybe I had missed a turn. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but when I looked behind me, the snow was the same, untouched. My footprints had vanished. A shiver crawled up my spine. I turned back toward the cabin, walking faster now, scanning the ground. I checked again, hoping I was just being paranoid. But no, there was nothing. The snow was still perfectly smooth behind me. I felt my heart rate quicken, and my breathing became shallow. This wasn't right. There was no reason for my tracks to just disappear like that. Panic began to seep in. I looked ahead, but everything around me looked the same. The trees were tall and bare, their skeletal branches reaching up into the gray sky. The clearing stretched out before me, the snow-filled ground now a featureless expanse. I retraced my steps, trying to calm myself. I knew I had been heading in the right direction. Didn't I? My breath caught as I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowed my pace, scanning the trees around me, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the line of sight. Nothing. I walked faster, my pace picking up as I became more desperate. The snow crunched loudly under my boots now, the sound almost deafening in the otherwise silent woods. I turned once more, glancing behind me, and again, the snow was untouched, smooth, and pristine. My footprints were gone. I didn't know what was happening, but it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none made sense. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel it pounding in my chest. I turned again, the fear creeping up on me, the unsettling feeling that something or someone was following me. I couldn't shake the thought. What if there was someone out there? Someone who had been watching me, waiting for me to realize I wasn't where I thought I was? My steps quickened to a jog, and then to a run, my boots kicking up snow behind me as I pushed through the trees. I wasn't sure if I was running from something or if I was running towards something. All I knew was that I needed to get back to the cabin. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, biting at my skin as I ran. My legs burned from the cold, from the effort, but I didn't slow down. I had to get back. I had to make it back to the cabin. I kept telling myself that, over and over, but then I heard it, a twig snapping behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking, but there was no one there, no one in the snow. I took off again, running faster now, pushing myself harder, my breath coming in quick bursts. I was getting close, I had to be. The cabin wasn't far off. I could see the vague outline of the trees ahead, where the clearing should be. It was there. I just had to keep going. Then, another noise, another crack of something behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. This time it was closer, too close. My pulse was racing, and my stomach churned with fear. The snow around me was quiet again, no longer full of the sounds of my running footsteps. The world around me felt hollow, empty, and then I saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. My blood ran cold. I turned and ran again, the cabin now so close I could almost taste it. My legs screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to make it back. I had to. I kept running, eyes darting behind me. The figure was still there, just behind the trees, always following. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, staying just out of view. I wasn't going to make it. I was going to the cabin. It was there, just ahead, the faint glow of light from the windows visible through the snow. I pushed harder, stumbling in the snow, and finally, I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving as I locked it. I leaned against the door for a moment, breathing heavily, my body shaking from adrenaline and fear. I looked around the cabin. The fire was still burning, crackling in the hearth, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the cold that still clung to my body. But the feeling didn't go away. I moved to the window and peeked through the blinds, my eyes scanning the darkness outside. The snow was still falling heavily, swirling in the wind, but I didn't see anyone. There was nothing but the empty woods stretching out beyond the cabin. No figure, no movement. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before I heard it. The doorbell, soft, almost tentative. I froze. I didn't answer. I didn't even move. I just stood there, staring at the door. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was silent now, except for the sound of my own breathing. The doorbell rang again, once, softly. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, couldn't. I could only listen. And then, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The cabin was silent again. Just the wind, just the snow. I stayed by the window for a long time, watching, waiting. But nothing happened. No footsteps in the snow. No sound. Nothing. I eventually made my way to the couch, still rattled, still uneasy. My body ached from the cold and the fear, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that bell, that soft, haunting ring. And as I sat there, staring out into the storm, I knew something had been out there. Something had followed me, and I wasn't sure if it had gone away. But the silence was a kind of answer. I was safe, for now. I had rented the cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway, a place far from the noise of the city. Just me, a book, and the crackling fire in the old stone fireplace. It seemed like the perfect spot to escape the chaos of life and have some time to myself. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with wooden walls that smelled of pine and the faint scent of old cedar. It had a large window overlooking the forest, where the trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying in the wind. There was no landline in the cabin, which didn't bother me at all. I liked the idea of being completely disconnected for a while. My cell phone barely got any reception, so I didn't bother checking it much. I had everything I needed. My favorite book, a warm fire, and plenty of time to just be. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the flickering light danced around the room, casting shadows on the wooden beams above. The first night was peaceful. I read for hours, occasionally glancing up at the fire as I lost myself in the story. The only sounds were the occasional gust of wind outside and the fire popping and crackling. It was perfect. Just as I was about to turn in for the night, I set the book down on the small wooden table beside the couch and stretched. The fire had burned down to just embers now, the room feeling much colder. I grabbed a blanket from the back of the couch and wrapped it around myself as I made my way to the bedroom. As I settled into the bed, the wind picked up outside. The trees outside howled in the breeze, but it wasn't anything I couldn't sleep through. I turned off the bedside lamp, and the room plunged into darkness, save for the faint light of the moon shining through the window. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the wind lull me to sleep. I was jolted awake by the sudden ringing of my cell phone. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I fumbled around in the dark, my hands searching for the phone on the bedside table. I didn't recognize the number. I thought about ignoring it, but something made me pick it up. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe I thought it could be important. "Hello," I said groggily, my voice thick with sleep. The voice that came through was soft, barely a whisper. "I see you." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My stomach sank, and for a moment, I couldn't think. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, trying to make sense of the words. But all I heard was the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing on the other end. My heart raced in my chest. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake, adrenaline coursing through me. My fingers trembled as I held the phone. Who the hell was this? I tried to speak again, but my mouth felt dry. I didn't know what to say. I hung up, convincing myself it was some sort of prank or a glitch in the phone signal. It was probably some kids messing around, I told myself, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that clung to me. I placed the phone back on the table, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to sleep. The room felt too quiet, too still. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening to the wind outside. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation for what had just happened. Maybe it was just some weird thing with the phone signal, I thought. It wasn't like I had good reception here anyway. But then the phone rang again. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, sharp and clear. I stared at it for a moment, hesitant. I didn't want to answer it, but something pulled me to do it anyway. I picked it up again, and there it was. The same whispering voice, softer this time, but unmistakably there. "I see you." I could feel the blood draining from my face, my hands trembling. I slammed the phone down and let out a shaky breath. I had no idea what was going on, but my body was telling me to be afraid. I tried to tell myself it was just some sick joke. Maybe someone who knew I was alone in the cabin and was messing with me. But that voice, it didn't sound like a joke. It sounded too real. I tried to shake it off. I couldn't let this ruin my weekend. I grabbed my book again, trying to lose myself in the pages. But every time I glanced at the phone, I felt a chill run through me. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch a little longer, and every creak of the old wood felt like someone was moving around the house. I told myself it was just the house settling, but that didn't make the uneasy feeling go away. The night dragged on. I eventually fell asleep, but I kept waking up every few minutes, feeling like I was being watched. The wind howled outside, but I could have sworn I heard something else. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, just outside the cabin. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept well at all. My eyes felt heavy and I was jittery. I went about my day, trying to focus on the beautiful forest around me, but my mind kept drifting back to the phone call, the whispering voice, the breathing. That night, the phone rang again. I had been trying to keep myself busy, but I had barely eaten dinner, too distracted by the events of the previous night. The phone sat on the table, mocking me with its silence. It had been hours since the last call, and I had almost convinced myself it was just a freak thing. Maybe the phone signal had just been bouncing around weird. But then it rang. I answered it almost immediately, this time without hesitation. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to. I needed to confront it, whatever it was. "I see you," the voice whispered again. This time, there was something different in the voice. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was clearer, more defined, and there was a faint crackling sound in the background, like the phone line was strained. It was almost like someone was standing right there, just on the other side of the phone, whispering directly into my ear. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, trying to make sense of it. But the only thing I heard after that was the same steady, labored breathing. I was about to hang up when the voice changed. It became louder, sharper. "I'm in the cabin with you." My stomach dropped. Couldn't breathe. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked around the room in a panic. The place was silent, but it felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if something was in the room with me. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I dropped the phone. It fell to the floor with a thud, but I didn't pick it up. I stood frozen in place, straining to hear anything that would tell me I wasn't losing my mind. And then I heard it, the soft creak of the floorboards. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking down the hallway outside the room. The sound was slow, deliberate, like it was trying to stay as quiet as possible. My heart raced. I backed away from the phone, my feet stumbling as I tried to make my way toward the door. But I couldn't bring myself to open it. I didn't know what was out there. I didn't know what was in here with me. I grabbed the fireplace poker from the corner of the room, my hands shaking as I held it tightly in front of me. I listened for any sign of movement, any clue about what was going on. The creaking of the floorboards stopped. I didn't dare move. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with fear. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. It was close, right outside the door. I could hear the slow, deliberate inhalations. They were steady, controlled, like they were savoring the moment. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. I wasn't sure if this was some sick prank or if I was about to face something far worse. I couldn't make sense of it. The door creaked. It was the faintest sound, but it was enough to send a chill through me. Someone was turning the doorknob. I knew I had to act. I rushed to the window and threw it open. The night air rushed in, cool and damp. I climbed out of the window, not caring if I got cut on the sharp edges of the wood. I needed to get out. I ran into the forest, away from the cabin, away from whatever was inside. I didn't look back. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I don't know who or what was in that cabin with me, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back. Not now, not ever. I rented the cabin to get away from everything. I needed space, time to clear my head. The world had been weighing on me. Work, people, noise. So I searched for somewhere remote, somewhere isolated. A cabin tucked deep in the woods seemed like the perfect choice. No cell service, no distractions, just me, nature, and silence. It was perfect at first. The drive out was long, but the kind of quiet that comes with traveling through thick woods was oddly soothing. The cabin itself was small, but cozy. It sat on the edge of a forest, surrounded by a blanket of snow that seemed to stretch on forever. There were no neighbors, no lights, just the occasional chirp of birds or the rustle of a tree in the wind. It was everything I needed, peaceful, calm, isolated. It felt like I had stepped into a different world, away from everything I knew. I spent the first couple of days just enjoying the solitude. I went for walks, bundled up against the cold, and sat by the fire reading books I hadn't touched in years. There was something comforting about being completely disconnected. I could breathe easier, think clearer. But by the third night, something shifted. It started small movement outside the windows. At first, I thought it was animals, maybe a deer or a bear. It's not uncommon to see wildlife in these parts, and I was a bit excited to see something up close. But the figures I saw were strange. Too large to be deer, too quick to be a bear. The shape of them didn't seem right either. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks on me in the fading light. Or perhaps it was the wind shifting the trees. But as the night wore on, the feeling didn't leave. I tried to ignore it, but the movement continued. I had shut off the lights and sat by the window watching. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance, something flickering past the edge of the window. Then, a dark shape slowly moved along the line of trees. My heart rate sped up. It was too deliberate, too methodical to be an animal. Whatever it was seemed to be pacing back and forth, always staying just out of full view. I couldn't make out any details, but the sense of something or someone watching me grew stronger. I told myself it was probably just my imagination. The isolation was getting to me. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or the wind. But the next few hours were restless, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next night, I decided to stay awake, determined to see whatever it was that was causing the strange movements outside. The clock on the wall clicked past midnight, and the cabin was still. The fire had long since burned down to embers, leaving the room dark and cold. I sat up in the chair, watching the darkened windows, waiting for anything to move. The wind was quiet, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Then I saw it, the figure, just at the edge of my sight, moving along the tree line. It was tall, taller than any animal I had seen around here. It moved with purpose, steady and deliberate, not like the random movements of a creature. It paused for a moment, then disappeared into the shadows again. My pulse quickened, and I leaned forward, trying to catch a better look. My breath came quicker now, but I didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I didn't know what to do. Was it someone in the woods? Maybe a hiker or a person looking for shelter? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that didn't make sense. No one else should be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen any sign of anyone else since I arrived. The figure didn't reappear that night, but the unease lingered. I stayed awake for hours, staring out the window, but nothing else moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me from the darkness. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone out there for God knows what reason, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. By the time morning came, I felt exhausted, but I had to go out. I had to see if there was any sign of what I had seen the night before. I bundled up against the cold and stepped outside. The fresh snow crunched under my boots as I made my way around the cabin. The world was still, and the air was sharp with the bite of winter. There were no tracks in the snow leading away from the cabin. No signs of animals, no marks from anyone walking around. The ground was untouched, perfectly smooth, but as I rounded the corner of the cabin, I froze. There, in the snow near the window where I had seen the figure, were fresh footprints, large, heavy impressions in the snow. They were clearly not from any animal. The prints were too deep, too wide. They were human, but the steps didn't match any normal pattern. They were uneven, almost as though the person had been deliberately trying to hide their tracks. I knelt down to examine them. They were recent, the snow still undisturbed around the edges of the footprints. Whoever had been out here had been here last night, and they had been close, very close. I tried to ignore the panic rising in my chest. I stepped back from the prints, scanning the woods around me, but there was no movement. The trees were still silent. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe it was someone who had lost their way or was simply passing through. There were many explanations that didn't involve danger. But then I saw something else. Near the edge of the woods, at the far side of the cabin, there was a mark in the snow. A trail, but not from someone walking. It looked like something had been dragged. I followed the trail, my boots sinking into the snow as I moved cautiously. It led to a small patch of trees, where the marks stopped abruptly, as if whatever had been dragged had been lifted and carried into the woods. My heart was pounding now, and I felt the weight of the isolation pressing in on me. No one else was out here. I was alone. Whoever or whatever had been watching me had been here. I quickly returned to the cabin, locked the door, and shut the windows. I didn't know what to think anymore. My rational mind was trying to tell me I was overreacting, that there was an innocent explanation, but the sight of those footprints, those dragged marks, couldn't be ignored. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease. I checked and rechecked the doors and windows. I didn't go outside again. Night fell, and again I sat by the window watching. This time I wasn't waiting for movement. I was waiting for something else. The night was cold, and the silence was deafening. But there was no shadow at the edge of the woods. No figure pacing back and forth. It was just darkness. I couldn't tell you exactly when I started to feel a little foolish. Maybe it was the absence of any more strange sightings. Maybe it was the weariness settling into my bones after days of tension. But by morning, I had convinced myself that I had let my mind run wild. I was just spooked by the isolation. The drive home was long, and I didn't look back at the cabin once. When I got back to the city and caught up with life again, the memory of the cabin faded a little. But I couldn't forget the feeling, the sense that I had been watched, followed, hunted. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but every time I saw someone standing still in the distance, I couldn't help but wonder if they were watching me. And every time I saw someone's footprints in the snow, I had to fight the urge to look over my shoulder. Then, months later, I heard a story about a cabin, not too far from where I had stayed, where someone had disappeared. The person was never found, not even a trace. They had gone to get away from everything, just like I did. But the woods took them, and no one ever knew why. The only thing left behind were footprints in the snow, and the vague feeling that someone had been watching. It was then I realized, maybe it wasn't just my imagination. Maybe some places don't let you leave so easily. I had been in the cabin for a couple of days before I noticed the door in the basement. The place had been abandoned for years, tucked away on the edge of some remote forest. The kind of place you go to get away from everything, a last-minute decision when I needed a break. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. Wooden, weathered, and a little run down, but nothing too alarming. A few cracked windows, creaky floorboards, a broken coffee table that looked like it had been through a hurricane. The kind of place that screamed old family vacation home. A bit forgotten, but not necessarily sinister. I hadn't explored the basement until my second day there. Most of the time, I was content sitting on the porch, looking out over the woods, thinking about nothing. It was peaceful, quiet, no neighbors for miles, no distractions. But something gnawed at me on that second day, a feeling that I needed to explore, to see the whole place. That's when I noticed it. The basement door, tucked behind a couple of shelves near the stairs, hidden just enough to go unnoticed. A heavy, old door with a rusted padlock. It wasn't the padlock that caught my attention at first. It was the door itself. There was something about it, something that felt off, like it didn't belong. It wasn't like the other doors in the cabin, which had peeling paint and worn-out knobs. No, this one was different, more solid, more final. And it was locked. Not just locked with a regular bolt or latch, but with a padlock that looked like it had been there for a long time. I tried to push the door open at first, but it wouldn't budge. My curiosity deepened. I told myself it was probably just storage, a closet full of old junk that nobody bothered to go near. But why lock it? Why keep it hidden behind a stack of shelves? That nagging feeling wouldn't go away. After a while, I stopped thinking about what was on the other side and started thinking about what might be there. By the time nightfall rolled around, I had made up my mind. I grabbed a crowbar from the tool shed out back. The old cabin had its share of repairs, so there was no shortage of tools to choose from. I walked back into the cabin, feeling a little foolish, like a kid sneaking around after hours. But I wasn't a kid anymore. I had to see what was behind that door. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the fact that something was locked away from me. But there was no turning back. I took the crowbar, wedged it between the door frame and the rusted lock, and pried. Took some muscle. The lock was stubborn, the metal protesting as I worked it loose. The sound of the crowbar scraping against the rusted lock echoed in the basement, and I half expected to hear something upstairs, to hear someone telling me I shouldn't be doing this. But there was no one, just me and the thick silence of the cabin. After what felt like an eternity, the lock finally gave way. It fell to the floor with a heavy clank. My heart was racing, but my curiosity overpowered whatever discomfort I felt. I opened the door slowly, carefully, as if I were sneaking into someone else's house. The basement was cold. The air smelled stale, thick with mold and dust. I could feel it on my skin, in my lungs, and I winced as I stepped inside. The flashlight in my hand flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, creaking under my weight. It was darker than I expected, but my flashlight cut through the blackness in front of me, revealing what was hidden in the far corner. The first thing I noticed were the old mattresses. Several of them, stacked against the far wall, piled high like they had been left in a hurry. They looked ancient, their fabrics torn, and the yellow stains on them stood out in the dim light. I froze for a moment, unsure of what I was looking at. But it wasn't the mattresses that sent a chill down my spine. It was the sound, a shuffling noise coming from behind me. It was quiet at first, like something dragging across the floor. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the basement was empty. Nothing was there, just the smell of mildew, the silence, and the dim light that barely reached the corners of the room. I listened closely, my breath shallow, but the shuffling sound had stopped. My mind raced, trying to explain it. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe it was the wind or something caught in the floorboards. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I stepped farther into the room, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My flashlight flickered again, and I cursed under my breath. It seemed like it didn't want to cooperate, and in that moment, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I wasn't alone down there. I took another step, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, just beyond the mattresses, was a corner of the room I hadn't fully noticed before. The light from my flashlight barely reached it, but there was something darker than the rest of the shadows. I couldn't make it out at first, but as I stepped closer, the shape started to form. It was a large, dark shape, crouched low to the floor, almost as if it was waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. It was like the air in the room had thickened, like the weight of the place had shifted. The flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment, I saw it. A figure hunched over, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't human. I turned on my heel and ran. I didn't even think about the door. I didn't think about anything except getting the hell out of there. My feet slipped on the old floorboards as I scrambled toward the stairs. I barely heard the creak of the floor beneath me, too focused on getting to the top, on getting away. I reached the door, threw myself against it, and yanked it open. My pulse was thundering in my ears, but I didn't stop. I bolted up the stairs and slammed the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the basement door, too terrified to move. But as I calmed down, something strange happened. The fear started to wear off, replaced by confusion. The basement was empty. I knew that much. I had seen it. But then why did I feel like I wasn't alone? I turned and started to walk toward the kitchen, but then something caught my eye. The door. It was shut. The lock was back in place. I stared at it, not sure if my eyes were deceiving me. I walked over, my legs shaky, and looked more closely. The lock was exactly the same as before. The rust, the shape, the way it hung from the door. Everything was in place. I reached for the handle and pulled. The door opened with a slight groan, and I stepped inside once more. The room was unchanged. The mattresses were still piled against the wall. The air was still thick and musty. Everything looked just as I had left it. I searched the basement for any sign that something had been disturbed, but it was all exactly as it had been. The smell, the dust, the silence. I don't know what I saw, or what I thought I saw. I don't know if it was just the dark playing tricks on me, or if something real had been down there watching me. But I left the cabin the next morning, never looking back. The door remained locked, but I never went back to find out what was really behind it. Maybe some things are better left unexplored. I had been staying in the cabin for 3 days. It was secluded, far away from the nearest town. The kind of place where you go to get away from everything. I needed it. The quiet, the peace. It felt like a retreat, a chance to clear my mind. I spent the first few days getting settled in, chopping firewood, and exploring the area around the cabin. It was all pretty standard, nothing out of the ordinary. But that changed on the 4th day. Started off small. A faint, scratching sound, something I could just barely hear. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the side of the cabin. But as the day went on, the sound grew louder. It wasn't just a branch, it was too rhythmic, too consistent. At one point, it even seemed to change direction, moving along the wall. I convinced myself it was probably some animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel trying to get into the walls, finding some tiny hole to squeeze through. I tried to ignore it. I was alone in the cabin, so I kept my mind busy, reading, eating, and working on a few things. But the scratching kept happening. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again. It was a little unsettling, but I figured that was just the sound of nature at work. The cabin wasn't exactly new. It was old and worn, with a few creaks and groans here and there. I assumed that the critters had just found their way in and were causing a bit of chaos behind the walls. That night, the scratching got worse. I was trying to sleep, lying there in the darkness, but the noise kept me awake. It started slow, like it had been the previous nights, but then it began to grow more frantic. The sound moved from one wall to the next, sometimes stopping and then starting again. It was almost like whatever was behind the wall was trying to get out. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, that I'd look in the morning and check for any damage to the cabin's walls or foundation. But as I lay there, wide awake, I could feel my skin crawl. The sound was too persistent, too focused. It wasn't like a random animal scratching to get in. It was something more deliberate, and it was so close. It sounded like it was right beside me. I reached for the flashlight that I kept on the nightstand and turned it on. shining the beam towards the wall where the sound was the loudest. The beam danced across the cabin's rough wooden interior, but there was nothing. No hole in the wall, no raccoon or squirrel darting around. I walked over to the wall, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The noise was still there, louder now, almost frantic. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I placed my hand on the wall, listening, and it was like the scratching stopped for just a second, like whatever it was behind the wall knew I was there. I could feel the vibrations in the wood, the small shifts, like it was trying to burrow its way through. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just an animal. Just an animal. I grabbed the axe I kept by the firewood pile, my fingers tight around the handle. I hadn't planned on using it for anything other than chopping wood, but at that moment, I needed to feel like I was in control of the situation. I lifted the axe, walked back to the wall, and raised it high. The sound of the axe hitting the wood was loud in the silent cabin. The first strike hit with a sharp crack, and I saw splinters fly. I swung again, and the wood splintered even more, cracking open. My pulse raced as the sound of my own heartbeat mixed with the rasping, frantic scratching from behind the wall. I hacked at the wall over and over, not caring if I was damaging anything important. I just needed to stop that noise. I was exhausted, my arms burning from the effort, but I didn't care. I couldn't let whatever was in there win. After what felt like hours, the wood finally gave way. I cleared away the broken pieces, my eyes wide, searching the hole I'd made. There was nothing, just insulation, just the hollow space inside the wall, full of air and nothing else. The scratching stopped, the sudden silence almost deafening. For a few moments, I just stood there, staring at the hole, catching my breath. Maybe it had been nothing after all. Maybe the animal had just stopped when I broke through the wall. But then I heard it again, a faint scratching, but this time it was from another part of the cabin. It was louder, more insistent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze. I was too tired, too worked up to deal with this again. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe there was more to the cabin's structure than I thought. Maybe the walls weren't as solid as they appeared, and the sound was traveling through the beams. But no, that didn't make sense. I just made a hole in the wall. There was no reason the sound should have moved. I stood there in the dim light, gripping the axe tighter, listening as the scratching continued from the other side of the room. I knew I couldn't just stay there. I had to do something. I walked cautiously across the cabin, my flashlight darting from one side to the next. The noise kept moving, almost like it was following me, like it was in the room with me. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen, but there was nothing to see. No animals, no signs of damage, no explanation for the sound. I thought about leaving. Maybe I should pack up and get out of there, go back to town, tell someone what had happened. But as soon as that thought crossed my mind, I shook it off. I couldn't leave, not after what had happened. I had to figure it out. I wasn't going to let fear drive me out of that place. I sat down on the floor, exhausted and scared. My eyes wandered to the walls, every corner of the cabin, looking for any sign of something that could explain the noise. There was nothing. No cracks, no holes, no evidence of an animal or any other creature. The walls were solid. I was alone in the cabin, or so I thought. The scratching moved again, this time closer, like something was coming toward me. I felt the sweat on my brow, my fingers trembling as I held the flashlight. The sound was unmistakable, sharp and persistent, like claws against wood. But it wasn't in the walls this time, it was coming from beneath the floor. I dropped the axe, my heart thudding in my chest. I crouched down, shining the flashlight on the floorboards. My stomach churned as I ran my fingers over the rough, creaky wood, searching for any cracks or spaces that might explain the noise. There was nothing. The floor was solid. But then I saw something. A small, dark line near the edge of the floorboard, just barely visible in the weak light. I leaned closer, my pulse quickening. It was a crack, barely noticeable, but it was there. I could hear the scratching again, louder now, coming from that crack. It was almost like it was begging to get out. I stood up, pacing the cabin, trying to make sense of it all. I needed to break through the floor. I needed to know what was making the sound. But I didn't have a tool for that. My mind raced as I thought about what to do next. I couldn't just leave the cabin, not with that sound so close. The only thing left to do was investigate. I had to find out what was beneath the floorboards. I grabbed a crowbar I had been using for some of the repairs around the cabin and crouched down again, my hands slick with sweat. I wedged the crowbar into the crack and pried at the boards. They creaked under the pressure, but they didn't give. I pried harder, gritting my teeth as the crowbar slipped and slid against the rough wood. The floorboard gave way with a loud pop, and I ripped it free, my heart in my throat. I shone the flashlight into the hole I'd made. Nothing, just dust and dirt, empty space beneath the cabin. I stood there, dumbfounded. The scratching had stopped again, but now I was left with the quiet. The deafening, all-encompassing quiet that seemed to fill the entire cabin. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight again, scanning the hole. There was no creature, no animal, nothing, but the feeling that something had been there, something had been trying to get out. That stayed with me. And as I stood in that silence, I realized that the cabin wasn't empty after all. Something had been trying to escape, something that had been trapped behind the walls. It wasn't over. It would never be over. And in that moment, I knew that the scratching wasn't an animal. It had never been an animal.